This is the night sky that we see at our farm, where I'm speaking not far from Perth in Australia. Thank you, John, for your kind invitation to speak, and Sally Mail for suggesting we be part of this event. Why are we here? Researching engineering education. What's the problem we're focusing on? Is it an innate engineering desire for improvement, refinement, or innovation? Or is it just curiosity, the search for understanding and wisdom that characterizes humanities scholarship? I think that large improvements are possible. We need them to sustain and improve life on this planet. My evidence comes from many data sources, and over 300 interviews and a dozen field studies of engineers at work in several countries in several different settings over 20 years, representing all main disciplines. Now there's much to be proud of. Engineers by and large encounter few difficulties with engineering science in their jobs. Nearly all that we interviewed were amazingly satisfied with their career choices. Yet, there are large failures, with enormous social and economic costs, and the root causes can be traced back to education weaknesses. Issue number 1. What do you think is the success rate for large engineering projects? The criterion being that the investors get at least half the return they were promised. Choose the closest percentage from this list. Okay, have you written down a response? Here's an example, about 200 kilometers from here, where I'm speaking. Cost until 2008, $2.6 billion. Sold for $250 million in 2009. Plant was closed. Then it was reopened and upgraded for $400 million, and then finally mothballed in 2015. Nearly $3 billion in value destroyed. And unfortunately that's typical of many projects around the world. Operations and maintenance mistakes are also significant. Again, choose the closest percentage here. What do you think the cost is? Okay, what figures did you choose? Well, only 1 in 3 large capital projects succeed. 1 in 6 are complete write-offs, like the one I showed you. Though published data is scarce, maintenance and operating mistakes have been estimated to cost about 50% of turnover in the best firms. Much of that opportunity costs from lost production. These are appalling numbers, no? For government projects the figures are worse. Little wonder that engineers' reputations have been shredded, and we are unwelcome in boardrooms, C-suites, and cabinet rooms around the world. So, what do we know about the causes of these failures? Collaboration weaknesses predominate in lots of different ways. Now, what do students learn about collaboration in a technical enterprise? Okay, let's move on to issue number 2. Productivity measures the ability to transform materials into useful objects for a given amount of human effort. In other words, social and economic value creation. While education, training, organization, all of those influence labor productivity, it is engineered tools and equipment that amplify human effort. Now, have we been asleep at the wheel? For some reason, the people who prepared this data made the last interval 13 years, double the previous one. We should have seen about 9% growth if earlier trends had continued, instead of the 0.4% that we see today. If you need an explanation for stagnant or declining middle-class incomes in wealthy countries, and the political unrest that Donald Trump is exploiting, this is it. Economists have been pinning their hopes for productivity growth on the information economy. Well, I ask you, since when did gigabytes produce food, clothing, cars, or phones? In my engineering school, we stopped teaching anything about manufacturing 2 decades ago. Is that just a coincidence? How could we teach students that their job is to improve productivity? Somehow that aspect of engineering has vanished sometime since the famous ASEE Grinter report of 1955. Well, how about restoring the economic imperative in a definition of engineering? Like this. Engineers are people with technical knowledge and foresight, who conceive, plan and organize delivery, operation and sustainment of man-made objects, processes and systems that enable productivity improvements so people can do more with less effort, time, materials, energy, uncertainty, health risk and environmental disturbances. Note, less uncertainty. That's where engineers are really important. Ask me later if you need more on that. So, engineers have to play a part in restoring productivity growth in wealthy countries. We can see their growth here relative to the US. But what's happening in the rest of the world, where most people live? Issue number 3. The emerging world. On average, they are 5 times less productive than the USA. Indonesia 9 times. What does this mean in real terms? Take safe drinking water as an example. Here is drinking water being delivered in Jakarta. You wouldn't want to drink the pipe water. The cost? $70 to $130 per 1,000 liters. That's 50 of those bottles. And here is safe drinking water being delivered in a Pakistan refugee camp. Women still have to carry safe drinking water today in most parts of South Asia and Africa, and many other places too. The cost? Most of the cost is the imputed economic value of their unpaid labour. But it is a real cost, as any economist would explain. It's not much per hour. But water is heavy and hard to carry. Try it for yourself. And it's not just the cost. Because so many cannot afford the fuel, time and effort to boil and filter their water, nearly half of the children in these regions are growing up stunted. That's permanent damage to their guts, meaning they will be undernourished even if there is enough food. Hundreds of millions of children. A gigantic, almost incalculable social burden for all of us, way into the future. And here in Perth, the world's most isolated city in the driest continent. Just $3 for 1,000 liters, including the cost of the tap. Water supply is a quintessential engineering responsibility. Why such appalling high costs for the world's poorest? That's something that has stimulated my research on engineering practice and education. Why should the result be so different in the emerging world when the technology is simple and readily available to all? Well, engineering science is universal. Water does not go uphill any more easily in Jakarta than it does in Perth. Implementing engineering ideas relies on complex collaboration performances. And collaboration requires engineers to influence others. So, collaboration depends on social culture. It is much more difficult for engineers to secure effective collaboration in emerging economies. This leads us to a pressing research question. How does social culture influence engineering practices and outcomes? Now, high costs imply commercial opportunities. If engineers could learn how to overcome cultural barriers that inhibit collaboration, raising productivity to the same level as wealthy countries today, the payoff will be huge. People need safe drinking water. Get it to them at the same cost as in Australia, and you will be rich beyond your dreams, and the world will be a much better place. Issue number 4, climate change. Here we are, tracking towards 1.5 degrees warming on IPCC projections, with about 11 years to go. The only way to avoid the catastrophic consequences from exceeding 1.5 degrees warming is to reduce emissions. Like this: zero net emissions by 2050, or thereabouts. Well, world governments, apart from my country and the USA, have got on board, faster than I expected. The world of finance has too. Large corporates are now demanding that their engineers solve this. But how well prepared are we in the academy? I hope your students are completely familiar with this graph. Until about 25 years ago, engineers assumed an infinite world. Water was boundless, and waste could be freely discharged. Now we have to work with a finite world and a circular economy. Engineers need to learn to meet human needs with much less resources, energy, effort. In other words, to be sustainable, we have to be far more productive than we are today, not just in wealthy countries, but everywhere. Do we know how to teach our students to argue for emissions reductions? Do we know how to teach our students to deliver emissions reductions? Do we know how to teach our students about the critical influence of human behaviour on sustainability? Again, the commercial opportunities are huge if we get it right. I have summarized 3 weaknesses and the sustainability issue in terms of engineering performances. What are the common factors? Well, one is collaboration. Another is people and perceptions. These are the common factors across all these issues. Scant treatment of finance and value perception. And human behaviour is a critical element in sustainability. These ideas are rarely mentioned in engineering schools today. Now, what do students learn about collaboration in engineering schools? Collusion? Cheating? Maybe. Paul Leonardi studied senior software engineering students engaged in project-based learning program in which they were taught to collaborate effectively. However, many students did the opposite. Students said this: "You're supposed to be able to solve problems on your own." He went on to ask, why do engineering students often remain committed to practices that are counterproductive for the engineering occupation? Anders' book has shown that we know that corporate culture can sweep aside many of the influences of engineering education. Large project failures can also be attributed to well-known decision biases. Weak productivity growth could simply be the result of short-term investment strategies, and Facebook, and so on. However, in my own research, connections with education have long been evident. For example, I worked for a while with this bunch of young engineers, from 1 to 10 years of experience at a small local consulting firm. Over time, I noticed that, even though they met like this, they neither knew how to collaborate effectively, nor were willing to collaborate. It was almost as each individual were interacting with the data themselves. When you think about it, university engineering courses, by and large, focus on objects, so engineers in turn learn to think in terms of object worlds. No people. Images like this win engineering photo competitions. There are no people. Now, hidden curriculum can be a useful concept here. In 1985, Eisner described it this way: "What schools do not teach may be as important as what they do teach. Ignorance is not simply a neutral void. It has important effects on the kinds of options one is able to consider, how one can view a situation or problem." Part of the hidden curriculum which is also called the implied curriculum, consists of unspoken messages propagated by practices like assessment. Here are two common assessment performances: sitting alone in an examination hall, writing answers to questions; preparing an assignment submission on a laptop using a word processor. Both are solo writing performances. Sometime later, a moment of intense joy for the student. "Hey, I passed!" These experiences are repeated at almost every assessment, from some time in primary school onwards. What psychological connections are being formed by these repeated, intense experiences? Is it possible here that students are reinforcing a connection between the joy of passing, or at least relief for the preceding anxiety, and solitary writing performances? This possibly conditioned preference by engineers for solitary engagement with written work, emails and documents has been noticed since the 1960s, and described so eloquently by Leslie Perlow when she described how engineers saw social interactions as interruptions to real productive engineering work. Particularly among young engineers, and not just engineers, we have seen a pronounced shift in preference over the last 3 decades towards text communication. I think there is conditioning going on here. You're welcome to disprove it or find a better explanation. The repeated connection between the pleasure of receiving grades and written assessments reinforces an innate preference for communicating in text. Text acquires value because that is what gets you grades. There's nothing new in that, of course. Exams have been part of education for centuries. However, until recently, written communication required effort, time, and expense. Now it is fast, free, and easy thanks to ubiquitous messaging apps. So the barriers to written communication have melted away thanks to information technology, and an ancient preference for text is no longer inhibited. Collaboration relies on trust. We learned from studies in the 1950s that trust fades with written communication, distancing emotional feedback. A recent study here in Western Australia on virtual teams has, unsurprisingly, emphasized the critical importance of trust, and shows how face-to-face contact is essential for building trust, without which collaboration is far more difficult. Now here is the 5th issue, and this is an opportunity for a large improvement in engineering education. I have tried to show the timescale for rearing engineers, and by the way, I did not include pregnancy. It varies, of course. The number of years before and during school, the number of years in university classes. Though there is little data, it takes 5 to 7 years for novice engineers to become proficient to the point where they are really productive and independent of close supervision. This simple picture does not show the large attrition rate. Far too many engineering graduates never make it through the first 5 years of practice. Far too many, especially in the emerging world, never even get to work as engineers. So much of this education investment is lost. We could change that. For example, if we could halve the last 5 to 7 years in the workplace that engineers need to develop their practice abilities, there would be a large cost saving for firms, and 3 years added to their lifetime contributions until they retire. That might be worth going for. In our research, we have seen how mistaken expectations acquired through the hidden curriculum can inhibit early career learning. Water-repellent soils are common here in Australia. The summer heat bakes leaf litter containing oil, creating a highly water-repellent coating on soil particles. These water drops, shown here in the photograph, on soil from my garden, remained on the surface for several hours before finally soaking in. Our data has revealed that graduate engineers prefer to learn technical material in the workplace. They resist learning collaboration skills because they associate career success with in-depth technical knowledge. In other words, the hidden curriculum helps to create learning-repellent minds. Now, here's where I want to end this talk. It is often said that engineering education is misaligned with practice. But how can you align a tightly defined curriculum with something that is so variable, unconstrained, in the future, and much of it unpredictable? The black line bounding the university experience in this diagram is my symbol for rigidity. Curriculum is extremely difficult to change, as many of us have learned. Changes over the last 3 decades have had hardly any effect. Employers are no more satisfied with graduates than 30 years ago. Employability has not improved. And as Graham Gibbs pointed out in 1995, career outcomes for graduates were uncorrelated with academic performance. And my guess is that they still are. Now, workplace learning, the transition from education, is fresh terrain, and in engineering only just beginning to be researched. Workplace learning is widely dispersed and largely unstructured. There's lots of room to improve it and shorten this transition. We could help young engineers appreciate and enjoy learning how to work fluently with different social workplace cultures, how to appreciate the influences of value perceptions and expectations, and above all to understand how their university experiences, the hidden curriculum, has shaped their thinking. With these insights they could achieve so much more, and overcome the issues that I've addressed in this presentation. I think that's a worthwhile research challenge. I hope you are as excited as I am by the prospects that I have seen. The challenges here are wide open and unconstrained. Here is my new book, due out in September this year. It's meant to be highly practical and focused on this transition from education to practice, and overcoming the challenges that I've outlined in this presentation. I hope you'll recommend it to your students. Now, since retiring from teaching 4 years ago, I spend most of my time commercializing something I invented a while back. But I still keep writing on engineering practice and education. I think that part of the excitement I have about all the energy in engineering education research is this. I think the great innovations of this century will come from an understanding of people and technology and how we interact. And the engineering education research community is best placed to create these innovations because an understanding of human behavior, of course, is absolutely essential. Now here's my invention. It's just a tiny fridge with a fan inside. We started selling in Pakistan 5 years ago, and we're now in 5 countries. With enough of these around, air conditioning emissions could be eliminated. Otherwise, they're forecast to be equivalent to 0.5 degree of extra global warming by 2100. These machines provide the perception of comfort, with up to 10 times less energy per person. That's the kind of productivity improvement we need engineers to be able to achieve everywhere. Thank you very much. I expect you'll want to ask a few questions.